but a lot of very faithful attendees to these talks. It's my huge privilege today to introduce William Cooper Bailey, who has had the most fascinating career, not in theology actually, in chartered accountant and business analyst, but he's also got a high degree in Christian Orthodox studies, and he sings with Orthodox choirs and does all sorts of other very fascinating things. So I hope he'll say a bit about himself. You should all have a set of photocopies, pages OX1, OX2, OX3. You might need those for the talk. So, welcome, and over to you.
I'm told the first thing I have to do is to try and get this strange device to work. Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me all right? Sorry? Is it? Oh, it's gone off. Sorry, wait. Right, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation and welcome. I was asked to say a few words about my background. As you will may have seen from the advanced publicity, I've had quite a wide range of experience. Initially, particularly as a chartered accountant, but doing various advanced degrees at Cambridge, particularly focusing on orthodoxy and the early Christian church and where it comes from. You should, as I've been coming in, have had 3 handouts. Has anybody not got? You should have 3. If you've got a posh set of handouts, they'll have a colour picture on the front. If you've got a less posh set of handouts, they will have a dark grey and light grey picture on the front. As you will have seen coming in, if you were looking at the notice as to what we were going to be looking at, it says John Cassian, foundation stone of Western monasticism. And you might well have said, well, that's a fairly bold claim. Firstly, can he justify it? And I think particularly many people, and some of you may have heard particularly Metropolitan Callistos and some of the various other mystics on both this course and previous courses, but Cassian isn't generally a name which trips off many people's tongues. But particularly, as we'll come on to later, Cassian was to be the underlying root, the foundation for the rule of Benedict, which eventually came in worldwide into Western monasticism. You will see, if you look at the slide, it says Saint John Cassian. Cassian is venerated as a saint in the western half of Christianity, but not so much in the West. My personal view is that this is slightly the wrong way round, but as the talk goes on, we will get some more information. You will see also, you should have 3 handouts, which at the moment, there are 5 handouts in all, but don't worry, you're not being deprived. 2 more handouts will be coming halfway through the talk. To give you a background as to why I do this, first of all, it is so you've got a record of what is being said. The handouts, actually, they are a lot more than what is being said. I will be raising some of the key features from the handouts, and there to provide a much more deeper understanding and appreciation for the subject, and if you want to take it further, if there are gluttons for punishment, you have got the foundation stones for you to develop it. I'm also aware that this is number 7 in the present series of talks here in St Giles. Some of you here may have been to all the previous ones, and indeed to other courses run by the Oxford Centre for Spiritual Growth and other organisations. So that, but some also may be here for the first time. I would say you are all very welcome, and if some of it is for people who have been here, you regard it as more sort of background information, that is aimed very much at people who are here perhaps for the first time. Now, also, amongst your handouts, if I can ask you to look at handout OX3. Now here I have provided, again for people who want to take it further, a reading list, but this is a reading list with a difference. Perhaps, certainly I, like perhaps you, have been afflicted with reading lists of most eminent books, many of which went out of print in 1782. There are two types of references which I'm giving here. One is books which are actually in print. You may have to go to the United States, but certainly the ones here are, I think, actually in print. Also, you will find here there are various references to the internet. Now, a large number of the early church fathers and indeed mothers were translated particularly in the Victorian era, in the 19th century. Were a large number of people up and down the country who had a great deal of knowledge of Latin and to a lesser extent Greek, a large amount of spare time and not much to do. Therefore, take Cassian and various other authors and translate them into English. Now, this cuts both ways. First of all these translations now, they're all out of copyright. That means they can put them up on the internet and you can read them there. A few of them are being republished, but particularly in the light of modern scholarship, some of the translations and background comments, they are a bit wonky. On the other hand, they are free, you may notice, particularly if you look at some of these translations, and they tend to be long, many translations, they've all been translated into English, but you will then suddenly discover 20 or perhaps 30 pages which have been left in Latin. That wasn't because the Latin was completely beyond them. As you may be aware, certainly some parts of Cassian's work, particularly discussions with Desert Fathers, are rather sexually explicit and not perhaps suitable for particularly a Victorian audience, but provided you leave it in Latin, something which might offend Victorian sensibilities in English, it's absolutely fine if you leave it in Latin. Some of them, particularly Cassian, they have been translated, they have been interpreted, I would say, into by recent authors, and there you get typically extracts, so you're getting the real nub of it without the huge amount of verbosity, and you get comments and background information. Though on the other hand, you do have to pay £15.99 or whatever it is for it. Now, to turn more particularly to, I'm going to see if I can make this technology work. The slides which you see up there, these are more to provide a little bit of a framework. The handouts which you've got in front of you are a lot more detailed, so that you don't need to focus too much on Cassian, on the slides. If you look in particular at OX1, and as I said, if you've got the posh version, it will have a coloured picture on the front, or it may be a light and dark grey picture. Who was Cassian? In a nutshell, he was a monk. He lived roughly from 360 to 430, so we're talking about 4th and 5th centuries. In those days, dating was not nearly so precise as it is now, and you will see some sources talk about him as living 365 to 435, and he died at the age of 70. He was born in what is now Romania, Dacia as it then was. He was sent to train as a monk in Bethlehem, which is of course on the outskirts of Jerusalem. It was today, leaving aside the fact Jerusalem is divided, it is somewhat a suburb, but then it was reasonably close. He went there to be trained as a monk, and he visited at length communities in Egypt. Now, one of the things which you haven't got, but I'll come back to in a moment, is a map of the Mediterranean. I didn't think I would insult you all by putting a map of the Mediterranean into your handout, but he spent about 10 years of his life visiting communities in Egypt, and he visited Constantinople and Rome before finally settling in Marseille, in what is now France, where he founded 2 monasteries. Of course, he always found, well, in those days, and indeed certainly up to the Middle Ages, monasteries were typically founded in pairs. You have one monastery for the men and one monastery for the women. Bishop Castor of Apt said, "What on earth is going on? You've been in Egypt for a long time. Please write something down to tell us what's happening." And the 2 major books he wrote, and we'll come on to those in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. The Institutes, which describes, can you see all right? I'm not sort of standing in somebody's way. Which describes what is going on, and conferences which were records of discussions with senior monks. And he died in Marseille in 430, or if you read some other sources, he died in 435. Now, to provide a little bit of background as to what was going on, could I ask you to turn to the other side of your OX1? This will have in the middle a blob. This is a timeline, highlighted in yellow if you've got the good copies, and light grey if you haven't. Just to think and put into context where the monastic communities in East and West, where they come from. Up at the top, particularly in the very early days, Christianity was under persecution, and but even then, people might well go into the deserts to get away from it, or perhaps to get away from persecution. Now, I've been told I mustn't touch the screen in case it collapses or something, but it was mainly into Syria, but particularly into Egypt down there. When people think about Egypt today, it's seen as being the Sahara Desert. Then it was actually the main granary for the Roman Empire. It was a place where people could live, but live in solitude. As you may recall, when Saul of Tarsus, when he was converted at Damascus, one of the first things he did was to go on retreat, actually probably into what is now perceived as being Iraq. But communities started to develop, and you can see on this timeline, I've given a few people. If you were here to hear Metropolitan Callistos, he was talking very much about the Desert Fathers, but they started. Anthony of Egypt, 251 to 356, is generally regarded as being the first monastic. That is almost certainly not correct. but he was the first one who perhaps publicized it. Initially, it was hermits living on their own. But a major change came with the Edict of Milan when Christianity became tolerated. Initially, Christianity became tolerated. Before long, as you can see here, Christianity became mandatory. And one of the things which got people upset, I think today, one can get one's vicar or rector upset if you say, what is the absolute minimum I need to do in order to get a baptismal certificate? For any sort of, before long, any sort of government role, including street sweeper, you needed a baptismal certificate. And to go to somebody who might have faced persecution, and to say, what's the minimum I need to do to get a baptismal certificate, that was highly offensive. And people said, we want to do much more for our Christianity than what is the bare minimum. And these communities, they started to expand. They expanded to be very large. Some of them had perhaps 2,000 monks or nuns in them. They were really colossal organizations. I think the only rough equivalent they have now may be in some parts of Romania, where there are very large monasteries. Not on that scale, but a lot of people. But the background was unpleasant. Fundamentally, the Roman Empire was collapsing. I see I've put in here 476, fall of Rome. Please don't take that too seriously. It didn't suddenly collapse in 476. It was a long period, but I wanted to focus on it. First of all, the Roman Empire split into two parts because they thought it would be easier to organize, into the East and the West. And when the split came, the East and West actually had different problems. The East had the rise of Islam and the Muslims, the Ottoman Empire coming along. The Western, well, one thing I put here is barbarian invasions. I put in here a particular example because the winter of 406 to 7 was particularly cold, and we have cold winters occasionally. This was very, very cold, and the Rhine froze. There weren't all the power stations keeping it warm, so you say, well, that's very interesting. The problem was that the Rhine was the Roman frontier. The Romans controlled the shipping. If you wanted to have a ship or a boat, you had to get permission from the Romans. And they could hold the frontier with minimal staffing, if you like. When the Rhine froze, barbarians simply walked across. There were, of course, many other features, and but there was a difference between the West, which was the East. Islam was very much, they were very much theologians, theologically based. The barbarians were not. So one of the first aims which the church had to do was to start converting the barbarians. And this was a different proposition from what was being faced in the East. This slide, it summarizes a little bit. We started off with ad hoc communities, then hermits, and I mentioned Antony of Egypt, and when the two sides, parts of the Roman Empire started to split. Can you see all right? The problem with the split was, apart from administrative, the eastern part tended to speak Greek and the western part speak Latin. And whereas previously there had been, most people or educated people had been bilingual in both. The Greek side forgot how to speak Latin, and the Latin side forgot how to speak Greek. So that there tended to be a different types of community. The powerhouse had been, the East was particularly Syria, and to a lesser extent Egypt, and to a lesser extent Egypt, particularly then, as indeed now, the Egyptian church, or Coptic church, was very powerful. I mentioned the internet in passing. If you ever want a really well-informed websites, a lot of the Coptic websites today are extremely informative. I do recommend that, and they provide a good introduction to, I was going to say the early church. The early church was rather a Coptic or Egyptian slant. Now, but also there was a difference in tone between these two sides, between the East, which tended to be more philosophical, and the West, which tended to be what I would describe as Roman civil engineering. A lot of the Roman buildings, or a few of them, these ones as well, Roman civil engineering is still standing today, and it has come down right to the church today, very, very well assembled, engineered prayer books. And these two, what was going on in East and West, they were described by two people, both by the name of John Climacus in the East, John of the Ladder, which we're not looking at here, but particularly John Cassian in the West. Now, if you look at OX2, where you have got a, this is describing a little bit more, this was actually focused on monastic authors, and I want to concentrate in this talk particularly on the Western Empire. You see, and here are various authors and people who are doing writing, and so that if you want to look these up, there's overviews in the handout, in the reading lists on OX3, but you can see that particularly John Cassian. As you can, the background to John Cassian, as I indicated very briefly, but a little bit more now. When he was a monk at Bethlehem, he travelled extensively, particularly in Egypt, where you had these very large communities, 100, perhaps 1,000 or more monks or nuns living in a Christian community in the desert. And he went to the west, to Marseille. He knew both sides. He was ordained deacon by John Chrysostom in Constantinople and ordained priest in Rome. And he went to Marseille to found 2 monasteries. Now, and when he was there, he was founding his monasteries, and the local bishop said, you know, you've got a lot of experience. We want to know what is going on in Egypt, and how do they run it? What is there, so that we can take what is coming from Egypt as a blueprint for our own, for running our own communities. It might be good, it might be bad. At least we would like to know what they are doing, so that we've actually got something down in writing. And he produced these 2 books. He actually did write 1 or 2 other works. The 2 main ones were, first of all, the institutes, which cover 2 things. First of all, how are these monasteries run? What do they do in terms of structure, in terms of admitting people? How do they keep discipline? How do they organize themselves? how do they run their daily life and their services, and also what advice would you give to people on running a Christian life. Now, if you look at this, you'll see it's actually about, he wrote the Institutes about 10 or 20 years after he'd actually been to Egypt. So it was very much his interpretation of what he had seen. And the other major document, Conferences, and that is a great huge book, it's about 900 pages long, and the Conferences, that is detailed descriptions with a lot of the very senior monks. Now, if you were to say what exactly is in these, can we have a look at it? The answer is yes. Those are on handouts OX4 and OX5. Could I please ask somebody to distribute handouts OX4 and OX5? You will find potted into the same format. They're only one sheet each, but there are two sides to it. OX4 sets out what is in the Institutes, and OX5 sets out what is in the Conferences. Also in this, I have got one or two extracts, short extracts. They tend to be large, detailed documents, so that when you go away from here, you say, did the speaker actually give us anything which Cassian had written? And the answer will be yes. Not so far, but wait for OX4 and OX5, which are coming round. Right. Just before we get down into looking at a little bit of the details of these, I think it's worth underlining why Cassian actually, how he has exercised his influence. Both of these books are substantial works. The Institutes are about that thick, the Conferences are about that thick. They're very large books. They're very comprehensive and very detailed, but the main thing is that they were used as the foundation by St. Benedict for drawing up the Rule of Benedict. And if you have read the Rule of Benedict, he describes it as a little rule for beginners. And if you read the last chapter, which I think is chapter 73, but I'm open to correction, it says, this is a rule for beginners. If you want to take it further and go further with the Christian life, read Cassian, the Institutes and Conferences, because this was what, and the early fathers and the authors of the church. And from being huge books, Benedict compressed it down into a very simple and easy to read guidelines. It's still in print. I understand, I think it is London Business School, which has actually used the Rule of Benedict as a basis for running a company. Companies aren't run by abbots, but if you use your word processor and you replace abbot by managing director or chief executive and do a few other changes, it is a way to run a Christian community, a family, a personal life. There were particularly quite a number of other rules at the time, and they still exist, particularly rule of St. Augustine and St. Basil, but these tend to be very, very brief. The rule of St. It is very concrete what to do, what to, make certain if you don't have your knife by your side in your bed in case you cut yourself while you're asleep. And very, very practical. And it was promoted particularly by Charlemagne, so that the rule of Benedict, one thinks particularly in the of Benedictine communities, of whom there are a large number, incidentally in the Anglican and Lutheran churches as well as the Roman Catholic Church. It has different slight flavours, particularly the Cistercians. But many of the Christian communities are based to a greater or lesser degree actually on the rule of Benedict. And this all is the consolidation of John Cassian. So when you're looking at many of these other authors, if you like, Cassian is the underlying baseline, the foundation. I think I called it the foundation stone. If you see a magnificent building, you say, "Oh, isn't it a nice building? We like the turrets and the towers." You may not always say, "What nice foundations." If I can ask you to look at OX4, that's. I'm afraid none of these have got pretty pictures on them. There are two parts to this. What I've called Wisdom from Egypt for French bishops. And the institutes, they're divided, and what I have given you here are effectively the chapter headings. Each of these chapters is between 10 and 30 pages long, to give you the title as to what there is there, and I put a few words in under each to give you a little bit of an idea for what is contained in it. If you actually want to go and have a look at it, you've got a reading list, so you can have a look. And you can see that overview of contents, it's divided into two parts: how to run a monastery, deadly sins and how to avoid them, very much a practical guide. And you can see all the foundations which are to come in later: clothes and how to dress, praying and psalms, day hours, community organisation. And that actually is covers selection, testing, admission of monks and organisation, postulancy. Somebody said, "I think I'm interested in joining your community or your monastery. What do you do? How do you see if they're being serious? What stages of probationary do we have?" Obedience to the spiritual father, and in particular to the abbot. Poverty, stability, poverty. You will see also I have here included one quotation I see under praying during the night and the psalms. The aim was that one would sing one would chant the psalms once all the Psalter every week. No merit in length. For in Egypt they do not care about the quantity of verses, but about the intelligence of the mind. I will sing with the Spirit, and I will also sing with understanding. Now this is very much at the same time as Cassian, he was the same time as St. Augustine. You may have heard St. Augustine's comments on the Psalms. Perhaps you know it. 2.5 ways to sing a psalm, 2 ways which are mandatory for everybody, and half a way which is a way which a few people can do, but don't worry if you can't. If you're singing the psalm, you must sing it with your heart, you must sing it with your life, and the way for some of the professionals, which some people can do, but don't worry if you can't, is to sing it with your voice. That is very much, I will sing with the Spirit and I will also sing with understanding. So that is actually, it is very, very much in line with Cassian. Now, if you turn over onto the other side of OX4, the remaining 8 institutes cover the 8 principal sins or vices, as purity was seen as an essential component of a Christian community. Not actually probably all that different from a Christian community today, Christian family, Christian person. But again, it provides the nature of the sin, the explanation in detail of the scope and its meaning, the causes of the sin, but more particularly the remedies for it. If you've got the problem, it's not a question of saying you've got a problem. Yes, you understand what the problem is. He covers also the remedies, what to do about it. If you go to the doctor with an illness and the doctor says, yes, I know what's wrong with you, that doesn't get you very far. The doctor needs to say you need to, I don't know, take a box of, take 3 pink pills twice a day or something. How to set about correcting the cause and the problem, and some practical examples. So it is a practical guide. It is not merely, it's turned into being a little bit of an academic treatise because it is so thick. There is so much of this stuff. We wish to penetrate the abyss and darkness of vice, and with the pure eyes of the soul, lay this darkness bare, bring forth the vices to light, which is a quotation from Institute 5, and this then goes much more onto what to do about it. And you can see he deals with some of the 8 principal sins. I don't think I will go through these in detail, but I've provided under each heading a potted summary of the contents which Cassian put. And you can see, I've also repeated here the sources, both the internet, which has got it all there, as I say, with a few bits, I think, in Latin, and a more modern translation, which has got a useful introduction with notes. Now, that was what was going on. And if you remember from looking at OX1, that was written for Bishop Castor, who was Bishop of Apt in France, and that was used for about 7 or 8 years, and Bishop Leontius in 426 or so asked for more details. The institutes, they are very much Cassian's summary of what was going on, the best he could, because he had visited a large number of these communities, and he then started to ask for conferences, and it's called a conference. A discussion is the modern word. Conference is something where you have, well, perhaps something like here this lunchtime, where we've got 500 people in an auditorium. Normally, this would really read discussions. So you have a discussion with, particularly Abba Moses, for example, quite a number of discussions on the goal and aim of the monks. Some of these are addressed particularly to communities, others to solitaries or hermits. It was when Cassian was asked actually to put down in writing as much as he could remember of what was actually significant from his discussions in Egypt. They cover a range of subjects, I see I've written, including a more conceptual approach to the major sins. The Institutes, very, very practical. The conferences, and I mentioned it is a huge book. I also mentioned it does tend to be go on and on and on at somewhat great length. Part of in my professional life recently, I was having to do a lot of analysis of the European Central Bank regulations for British banking. Those seem to come in about 2,000 or 3,000 pages for starters, and Cassian was actually a very good training ground for that. So that I'm afraid, and it's outside the scope of this conference, but the amount of legislation, guidelines, and other documents which are coming out of the European Union is driving rather a large number of people. Oh, and they also have to be translated into 23 different languages, as you are probably aware, so that if you really want to know what the European banking directives under MiFID are, and you really must read them in Lithuanian, no problem. Sorry, I apologise for the digression. Let us return to the conferences which I would say were discussions. And it gives the name, again, I have provided a list of the 24 conferences. There was also quite a lengthy prologue, and if you look at the modern translations, these tend to focus particularly. I've highlighted a few. Abba Moses on the Goal or Aim of the Monk, Conference 1, Conference 9 and 10 are in a lot of the modern versions on prayer. And I thought that I would also provide you with at least a few of the things which Cassian actually wrote. As I say, the whole document is 900 or so pages long and in small print. Here, to provide a little bit of background, in St Giles Church, Oxford, I've given you 1.5 pages or 1.25 pages of some of the quotations to give you a little bit of an idea as to the sort of things which he was discussing with these monks. Conference 1 with Abba Moses. And you'll see he did quite a number of discussions with Abba Moses. As I said, a large number of it. I decided to go and meet Abba Moses, and he was sitting on the whatever it is, and I said, "It is nice to see you, and if you can spare the time," and that goes on for a very large amount of time, which all gets cut out in the modern versions. Main message is short-term means purity of heart towards a long-term goal. The Christian life is hard and tough. It certainly was in Egypt, and particularly the way in which the monks lived was very austere. Key aim, the kingdom of heaven, eternal life, but to get there one needs a shorter term objective, which is purity of heart. Delights and pleasures come in the longer term. Keep a sense of proportion. Many have given away vast wealth. Many of these, they have given away land. Certainly, St. Anthony of Egypt, St. Anthony the Great, he gave away all his lands. You may remember he kept a little bit back because he was responsible for the upkeep of his sister, and he then gave away that and put his sister into a monastery. Need Christian love at the base, without which life becomes futile and sterile. And then over the page, essential to undertake fastings, loneliness for hermits, particularly in the later days. it was community-based. If there were hermits, then, as indeed now, and some of you may have been to a Christian community where sometimes they have hermits, very frequently the hermit will come back for Mass on Sundays, so that they are not totally cut off from everything. Mary achieved long-term benefits rather than Martha. Activities of the body are necessary, but are a means to an end. The higher gifts are those of the Spirit. Contemplation is not just looking and being present in the Lord, but seeing him through his creation. Not possible to move forward undisturbed by evil thoughts, but counter these with regular reading of Scripture and Lectio Divina. The mind must work on something too. Sources of inspiration. Watch very carefully. Beware particularly of bogus attractions. Prayer and how to do it. Particularly Conference 9, I've given some examples. There is some theory, some practical messages which come out of the conferences, many of which have actually been covered already in the institutes. And as part of this, as a way of illustration, if you like, I have given some quotations from Cassian for the meditation on the Lord's Prayer. And it was this which, as I say, particularly attracted St. Benedict when he came to drawing up his potted version, the Rule of Benedict. And as I say, this was the foundation stone. This was the underlying basis which came through to the Rule of Benedict and has since been widely adopted in Western monasticism. Although, like a grand building, quite often you don't say, what wonderful foundations. I think I would like to leave it there. They said, could I provide space for any questions, so that if anybody has got any questions, whether I will be able to answer the question is a completely different point, but I will be happy to do anything I can. Over to you.
If you want to ask a question, please indicate and then I can come round so that we can hear you.
I will have a swig of coffee and say that.
Yes.
OX2, you've got the monastic author's timeline. You've got the Western Empire, Syria. I wonder whether the Cappadocians fitted into that. Are they part of the East, or do they straddle, or is there influence?
I would say for this, Cappadocians really belong to the East. I think that particularly Syria and Cappadocia are both very much East. That is because, and there is a different, let me just see if I can, there's a different flavour. When one looks at the modern structure of Christian communities, there is a difference between the East and West. Western communities, a lot of them, they tend to be, I was going to say brandied. There are Franciscans and there are Benedictines. Rather like if I say, I went shopping this morning and I went into Boots and Waterstones or something, you've got quite a good idea of what I might have been getting. If I was in a village and I went to, I remember going into Carruthers and Scott, which is a small shop, you have no idea what Carruthers and Scott might or might not sell. So that in the East, the communities very much tend to be part of the normal diocesan structure. In the early days when Cassian was around, the monasteries were part of the diocese. That is why the bishop of the diocese said, Mr. Cassian, can you please write down what you've got? Because he was reporting into the bishop. It's very much a trend, not the universal trend, particularly in the West. Many communities are just part of the natural diocesan structure, but others, they have got this cross-country link-up, let's say Benedictines, Franciscans, and perhaps two of the most obvious. So yes, Cappadocians and Syrians belong in together. It's interesting that whereas John Cassian and particularly St. Benedict, if you like, set the standard, John Climacus, who was abbot of St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai, he wrote another book, quite a readable book, The Ladder of Divine Ascent, and that tends to be the focus for monasticism in the Eastern Church. Particularly, I think it is in the fourth Sunday of Lent. The Orthodox and Eastern Church, they have a particular theme for each Sunday of Lent, and the Ladder of Divine Ascent is a theme for one Sunday in Lent. So you've got two different outlooks.
I'm just thinking about what's really beneficial for a community that a monastery around. And is it particularly for the religious people, or is it particularly important for the politics and influence around? Also, could you just how a monastery can be more influential outside?
Yes, I think that. Yeah, I think your question is to what extent, you know, when this was written, were the institutes designed as particularly for one monastery, or was it a political thing? At that time, quite a large number of Christian communities were starting up in the West, and particularly the local bishop said, John Cassian, you've had a lot of experience actually in Egypt. Can you please write something down which people can adopt or not as they wish? The work of John Cassian was actually fairly detailed, was very voluminous. And if you bear in mind the environment then, hand copying out 400 or 500 pages of institutes, and I mean the printed version is 900 or so. It was a huge document. So that if you're starting a community then, as indeed if one is starting a community now, you may have seen in the press, I think it was last week or the week before, the Archbishop of Canterbury is starting up a new community, the community of St. Anselm in Lambeth Palace, which is opening its doors in, I think it's September of this year. Mainly focused on young people aged between 20 to 35 and initially for a period of 1 year.
Explain the true Christianity, how the monastery can be influenced. Just because is it purpose of monastery just to be community, or just explain the
focus of the monastery? Yes, the focus of the monastery is the Christian life. Developing the Christian life in a Christian community, and that is why half the institutes, perhaps more than half, are actually explaining how to live a Christian life, because Christianity and developing the Christian life is at the heart of it, because they felt that particularly the communities, let's say in Egypt, people would go from they might have a full-time job in Alexandria or something like that, and they would go to these communities in Egypt for spiritual direction. So that he was trying to incorporate that spiritual direction into the institutes. And then when Bishop Leontius said, this isn't enough. We want more spiritual direction. We want more guidelines on living the Christian life. That was why he wrote the conferences.
Can I ask you, mentioning spiritual direction, which is very close to my heart. Did people actually visit the monks and nuns in order to discuss their prayer life?
Yes, indeed, and it was one of the main focuses of these Christian communities. Was nowadays they would call it providing spiritual direction, because most people in Egypt and indeed the rest of the world, they have a full-time job. They've got a lot of things to do, but they do need spiritual direction, advice, guidance. How do we live the Christian life? Now that might be specific, it might be general, and that is one of the things which they did. People might go there for once a year, perhaps once a lifetime, perhaps more frequently. They might stay there for a long period. They might, I can get, next Sunday off work or something like that, so I will go and see them, so that they could... It is interesting, I mentioned on this slide, you can see ad hoc organisation. In the church, in the Orthodox churches, the Church of the East, it is assumed that everybody will have some sort of link with a monastery, with a Christian community for spiritual direction. It may be very occasional. You may remember in Albania when the communist regime collapsed and all forms of religion were completely outlawed, and the Christian church wanted to restart Christianity in Albania. The first thing they brought in was not the churches, not the cathedrals, not the schools, it was the monasteries. They set up the monasteries, which were going to be the powerhouse, and that is the basis on which Albanian Christianity today has grown up.
I was interested in what you said about Justin Welby's initiative. There are other examples, of course, and I'm very familiar with that Benedict lay community, which grew up under the auspices of Worth Abbey. And Christian Jensen nurtured them to a point where he then said, now you must go your own way and spread it yourselves to go, which was very interesting.
I think, yes, I think that if you like, particularly it is under Justin Welby, the development or redevelopment, re-establishment of Christian communities, it is one of his priorities. I thought, because they're organising a large conference actually up in Yorkshire, in Whitby, I think it's next month, so I thought, now that will be useful. I will go along to see what the latest developments are. To be told, oh no, that was booked up long ago. The demand is actually very high.
I think sadly as it's 1:30 now, we're going to have to draw to a close. Do you think it won't be?
Yeah, I do indeed, yes.
Some people have to get back to it.
Right, well, thank you very much.
No, thank you. It's been very